Welcome to Sounding Freedom and Liberation, a podcast series looking at the power of music and sound to engage with ideas of freedom and liberation. I'm Sharissa Granger.
And I'm Ferdia Stone Davis. Today we welcome our guest, Professor Andrew Bowie. Andrew Bowie is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and German at the Royal Holloway, University of London, and a jazz saxophonist. He has written extensively about the relationship between music and philosophy, showing how they are entangled with each other historically and how each illuminates the other. Works in this area include Music, Philosophy and Modernity by Cambridge University Press in 2007, and Aesthetic Dimensions of Modern Philosophy, published by Oxford University Press in 2022, alongside numerous articles and chapters and 2 introductions to German philosophy. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So we've started all our conversations with the same question to all of our guests, and that is to ask you what freedom means to you and how you practice freedom on a daily basis.
Blimey. Interesting question. I mean, my philosophical approach to freedom is pretty complex because the debate, as it's often framed in philosophy, seems to me completely arid. I mean, it's basically, if you live in a nature which is completely determinate, then what place is there for freedom in that? And that leads to endless kind of arid debates that don't go anywhere, to be honest. So in the face of that, you then start to think, well, okay, what do I think about freedom? And in some ways, I mean, this has been encouraged by reading Dewey fairly recently. You bring it very much down to earth. And the simplest way then to approach it is that you become aware of freedom when it's threatened. You know when you're not free in certain circumstances. And this, I think Albrecht Velmer says this, things like neuroses are freedom inhibiting. And so it comes down then to how do you overcome neuroses. And that pattern, seems to me, is the fundamental one, is that freedom makes no sense without the resistance to it, which is what Dewey says brilliantly in various places. So that's basically my response is, when you're in a situation which you find unpleasant, difficult, or you've got something to do, you kind of liberate yourself by overcoming the obstacles, rather than some sense of being able to do whatever I want to do. Now, clearly that does play a role. If social structures and power structures stop you doing things, then clearly you want more freedom. I mean, and that's utterly vital in relation to political questions of freedom. But it seems pretty fundamental that the way we make sense of things has something to do with the way we liberate ourselves from things that are getting in the way. I mean, I won't say any more about the music bit of that because that'll presumably come up in a bit. But that's roughly what I'd say anyway. And no, there's no definition of it, because there's no definition of anything apart from axioms in mathematics, and that's Kant. Definitions in Kant are projects for inquiry, which is brilliant.
It is, and actually, I suppose, connects well with maybe the take that we're taking in this series of conversations is actually to find ways of thinking around freedom, thinking through freedom and what it is, rather than to say, this is what it is. Yeah. I mean, because there's no it, as it were, in that sense. I mean, it's something which emerges in situ, and it's inseparable from what opposes it. Otherwise, that's shelling, actually. Otherwise, you wouldn't understand it, basically. So we all have an understanding of freedom because we all have a sense of when we're not free, as it were. And that can be invalid, it can be ideological, but the basic structure seems to be okay. Yeah. Thank you.
How did you come to be interested in your research, especially in terms of ideas of freedom, unfreedom, and liberation?
It came very much because not most, but a large part of my research has been in relation to aesthetics and art. And the point of the last book, The Aesthetic Dimensions of Modern Philosophy, is to try and reorient the direction of so much philosophy, because in most philosophy, especially in the Anglo-American world, especially in the analytical tradition, art and aesthetics are a separate, the philosophy of art, and even worse, the philosophy of music, which are two of the most arid subjects you could ever read. I mean, the distance between what you read when you're reading Peter Kivy on music and what you experience when you're listening to music and playing music is monumental. That then relates to why, and most of my work is concerned with modernity, when the death of God, not in a dramatic sense, but in as a metaphor for what happens when we give up on certain kinds of foundational ideas that would give you the big answer to something. And at that point, at the same time as that's happening, you've got the rise of modern science. And modern science, increasingly, encroaches on virtually every dimension of human existence. And at the same time, and this is kind of the theme of that book, this is clearly heading in a very disastrous direction. And so at that point, you start thinking, well, a philosophical response to the sciences doesn't worry about are they true, because that seems to me completely stupid. What tells you whether science is true is more science, not some clever philosophical theory, piece of epistemology. So the book's an attack on a certain conception of epistemology. And the attack is based on the fact that the emergence of the modern skeptical question, what founds most epistemology in the analytical tradition, with Descartes, is simultaneous in the same person, because he was a scientist, with the rise of increasingly reliable mathematics-based scientific knowledge. And if that's the case, why is it that you start asking about, well, is what we believe true? Is this really a microphone in front of me nonsense? At the same time as we are finding out, and they work, endless things through scientific theories. And therefore, something else is happening, and philosophy is not really attended to that in a useful way. But then if you start looking at the history of aesthetics, that is very much about what sort of relationship do we have to the world, not just in terms of truth, but in terms of what makes sense of the world, because we don't know, finally, whether what we think about the world is true anyway. And it's not always the most important question. The question is, does this make sense? Is it worth doing? Is it worth doing this? Because you can scientifically inquire to absolutely anything, into the piece of dust on the table in front of you, etc. But we don't. We look at it in terms of what things that make sense. And aesthetics seems to be the place looking at, reflecting upon what art tells us, where it shows up the dimensions of human relations to the world which often get neglected, which is why art can then become something of, liberate you from certain conceptions of the world, and keep offering you, and it seems to be part of freedom for me, offering you new perspectives on things, which are not just cognitive. I mean, they are new ways of relating to things, and hence, that will lead then to the link to music and so on. So, yeah, I mean, the aesthetic thing is kind of the foundation of most of what I do, is the sense that, well, there's other ways. I think Stanley Cavell says, knowing things isn't the only way of relating to them in the world, and that seems to be absolutely crucial.
In relation to this, though, there is a space for giving reasons, and so if one sets truth aside, and it's just simply what makes sense of things. It's not that we can still argue about that. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, no. I mean, one of the things that I'm utterly opposed to is the this almost universal belief that you see in every newspaper, every exchange online, that aesthetic judgment is just subjective. So you can't argue about it because it's just your taste, and that seems to me completely false. Because what we appreciate aesthetically, why do we then bother to learn, as it were, about art, etc., if we aren't thereby changing what we realise makes sense? And so you can argue about the truth of somebody's interpretation, or somebody claims that X music is better than Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. I'm going to go down guns firing, saying, no, it's not. That's not true. Unless you set up criteria for its being better than Mrs. Lemons that make more sense. And I defy you to do that for some piece of trivial art or trivial music. So again, that's part of what I'm saying. I mean, is that if you simply reduce truth to cognitive claims, as opposed to judgments basically, then you're missing out a huge amount, and you're leaving this kind of mad thing, which infects all contemporary culture. So it's just down to the taste of the individual. No, it's not. I mean, the taste of the individual is massively impacted by the media, by et cetera, ideology, and so on. And that one can make truth claims about that. Okay, you can't finally justify them, but I don't think you can finally justify anything, to be honest. So we're working in the realm of what makes more sense. And it makes more sense to say, well, a complex, deep piece of music which you can listen to endlessly. I've been listening to for 55 years. Is a better piece of music than a bit of punk sort of thing. Even though you like the punk more, yeah, you can like it. Well, that's fine. But I think art is more important than just what one likes, as it were. I mean, I'll never forget. I made myself listen to Schoenberg because I didn't get it. I didn't find it particularly problematic, but I just made myself listen to it, and eventually it made sense. And that was a vital experience. But by engaging with it, you open up new spaces of sense that you didn't have before.
And so if the kind of the interest in aesthetics, the aesthetic side of things was always there, was music... Because was music always your primary focus? Where did it enter in terms of your trajectory?
Well, because I'm not trained musically, it was initially. I mean, I wrote a PhD on history and the novel, which was in some senses already dealing with this. It was about what the novel tells us about history, the narrative history, and the science of history. If you're a German, sense of science. Can't actually communicate. So it was very much about what do we gain from reading Flaubert's L'Éducation sentimentale rather than reading the standard history books on that and trying to tease that out. Because clearly more people found the Flaubert somehow illuminating than would actually bother about reading the history of the 1848 revolution. So so it was, and the thing was that I always had a sort of a great love of music, and this is relevant. I was thinking this is irrelevant. So I learned classical clarinet and was vaguely competent, but as bad a reader as I still am. But started playing jazz, and we got opposition from the school, not sort of trying to stop us, but not encouraging us, so that we weren't allowed to do an improvised piece for the school music competition, which is a great way of making sure that I got completely obsessed by music. And then, I say, that put me off classical music till literally I then, as an undergraduate, read Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, a novel about a composer, as it were. And suddenly thought I'd better listen to the music he talks about, Beethoven and so on. And that was it. Then from that point onwards, I listened endlessly, along with the jazz, to classical music. And I always had the thought, at some point you'll get bored with this. And of course, nothing lasts forever. But it's actually the opposite. And that's why it's pushed more and more into my philosophical work, that actually you get more and more obsessed by music. Not in a bad sense of obsessed, but it occupies you in a way that nothing else does. So I then, and this thing you do, I think, as you get older as a philosopher, if you've got any sense, is that you increasingly try and commensurate what you do in your life with what you think philosophically. And I used to just regard playing jazz as this is fun. It's a nice way of meeting nice women, and all that sort of thing. And then you suddenly realise actually it's more serious than that, and you wish you'd practiced more. And so it then becomes this thing where, so how do I commensurate what I think about, what I do when I'm playing jazz, with what I think philosophically? And hence, and then you start to, because initially you feel, I'm not a musicologist, I'm not a great reader, but I have a fair idea of music theory. You can't play jazz without it. So you're slightly hesitant, but then eventually you realise that a lot of what people are writing that know more about music isn't actually getting to the point in a way that you think you should be getting to the point. So that moved the focus from literature to music, really, basically.
So, I mean, you've alluded to this already, but I suppose pointing towards the limitations of certain philosophical and scientific discourses around freedom, and the way that they shape notions of freedom. But something that also struck me was almost, maybe it's something like the ethics of freedom, that is particularly around, again, it connects with the idea of not thinking in the abstract, not thinking freedom in the abstract, but the need to attend to the experiences that people have of freedom, and what happens if you don't do that.
Yeah. I mean, the best example of that, which has occurred to me a few years back, is when I started to practice more, much more seriously, is that that's a perfect sort of, it's not even a metaphor, it's an instantiation of freedom. Because if you practice a lot and figure out how to do it well, so there's a technical side to it, which is cognitive, etc. But it means when you're playing and you're on stage and improvising, you can quite often get into in the zone, as it's famously called, where you don't actually need to think very much, but you're actually you're not producing mechanical stuff at all. You're not thinking very much because you're letting some part of your, I won't say brain, because I think that's dodgy. The brain is a lump of jelly with electricity in it. Let's say mind, but then even that's dodgy. But you're able to overcome obstacles and places where you'd never felt comfortable. You thought what I'm playing here isn't good, or it doesn't make much sense, or it's tedious, or it's cheesy. You start to find more and more space, and that seems to be a perfect metaphor for the sort of and the instantiation of the way I would see freedom.
Thank you.
So I think I wanted to relate this to other discussions of freedom, especially in relation to music, and also other kinds of music practices. So I was wondering about the interventions of Black philosophers from the radical Black tradition who remind us that freedom has always been, kind of shaped by histories of enslavement and colonialism. What do these debates that bring about, discussions with Kant, Hegel, Adorno, Schelling, mean for us now in relation to that? For example, how might these ideas help us think about struggles for freedom today, in the face of mass incarceration, forced migration, or even climate, injustices? So I just wondered how we can think them together.
I think the dimension I would think of in relation to that is the way that music constitutes communities as a shared practice. And it doesn't have to be a unified shared practice. The history of jazz is a great demonstration of that. That's precisely what it shouldn't be necessarily in a lot of circumstances. So the way in which in the history of jazz, the civil rights movement actually had a very close relationship to certain kinds of jazz and to what was fundamental to the most important jazz, which was precisely that you mustn't get stuck in what's already been done. That there's a kind of obligation that we are creating something new, and that comes very clear with bebop. It's fairly latent in there, but there's a very clear sense this is establishing a kind of identity. And it doesn't have to be just a black identity. I mean, it's vital that we acknowledge that it's fundamentally, it comes from black culture, but it's one that can then be shared, and that actually then creates space for, and it did, ways of opposing racism. And it still, in certain dimensions, seems to be able to do that. In a completely different angle, I worry quite a lot about a lot of the colonialist criticisms of, we shouldn't be doing Beethoven because it's white Western music. I think that's a huge mistake. I mean, it annoys a lot of people I'd like to have annoyed, but I think it's actually a very unproductive line, because I have no doubt and will never, have any doubts about the fact that certain things like Beethoven are unique and uniquely culturally valuable. But that means if they are, then there will also be resources for being not appropriated, simply being part of rethinking how we relate to the world. And so Beethoven is clearly a lot of the time about liberation. And I remember an ex of mine in Berlin saying she left the Marxist-Leninist party when they were trying to claim that Beethoven's Fifth was just bourgeois music. And I don't think it is just bourgeois music. It is bourgeois music, and it has the way it's been appropriated, the way that concerts are run, etc. That's getting better, I think, is regressive. But rather than, I've always said this about everything, you get the same thing in relation to literature as ideology, but it can be ideology, but it's also a lot more. And if we lose sight of the lot more, what have we got to replace it? The answer is nothing. So any kind of musicology that tries to sort of link this to colonialism, etc., unless there's a substantive link, which there will be in a few cases, but it doesn't work in relation to sort of Beethoven or Mahler, who was a left-winger anyway. And Bruckner was just not anywhere, think of great composers, anywhere, it makes no sense in relation to that, to try and, I'm all for focusing on neglected musical traditions, and jazz still is in some ways. It's always fighting for its own, to sustain itself. But I see no difference between the importance of Coltrane and the importance of Beethoven and so on. We should be looking in that sense, so that rather than ideology critique the whole time, which is a kind of cognitive activity. It's not looking at the aesthetic side of the thing, the liberatory side of the things. We should be looking for the positive side, and different ways of understanding art, which seems to be unquestionably important.
In relation, perhaps, to this, then, something that struck me was this idea of, quite rightly, that there isn't this absolute freedom, complete freedom to do anything one wants. It's always embedded in nature, in culture. But this idea that you have of a dissonance between individual and external norms. Is there any way that music can help us think that notion through, if think is the right word, but... I suppose it relates to, in that sense, to Charissa's, in what sense is a practice, can it be liberatory?
Yeah, I mean, it seems with the liberation, because it engages aspects of oneself that otherwise become neglected. I mean, the big thing I always avert to in writing about the philosophy of music is rhythm, because rhythm is a thing which can unite people. It's also which can be misused. Adorno says sometimes quite silly things about that. That jazz rhythm is like fascist marches or something, which is complete nonsense. Good jazz rhythm is precisely the fact that it's loose, it's non-military, it swings and so on. And so, and it's something which, I mean, you can actually push this quite a long way, as I do in the Music and Philosophy of Modernity book. You can actually see that, in a way, even cognition is based on rhythm. because rhythm is about linking separate moments into something that make more sense. Yeah, so just one thing like that or one thing like that makes no sense. And what's he doing, sort of thing. But if you then start turning it into a beat, it makes a certain vital kind of sense, which kids pick up on immediately, and it's vital for the way they locate themselves in the world. And I think in some ways music is precisely it's able to restore a certain kind of, in the positive sense, childlike relation to things, because it absorbs you, it makes you participate in things, and so that at one level it's somatic, it's just grabs you, and it can be questionable, marches, etc. But another level, it's something that takes you to a place you otherwise can't go, basically. And the other thing with rhythm is that if it's about synthesis, connecting things together, you can kind of see it as the beginning of what makes knowledge possible. There's a passage in the book, which links Kant's arguments about schematism, the way in which we identify things without having a fixed rule, to rhythm. I mean, and the German romantics actually picked up on this and say things like that. They never expound it, because they never do, or very rarely do, as a theory. But there does seem to be a clear link between our ability to make sense by connecting things together and seeing identities and so on, to our capacity for rhythm. And the capacity for rhythm is pre-intellectual in that way, and can affect, going back to your question about norms, can affect how we think about things. And certainly playing jazz, it's so important that does this swing, and there's no final answer to why it's so important, but nobody questions it's important. When it's not swinging, it's nothing makes sense. And in a sense, when life's working, it's swinging, because things make sense spontaneously. And you can alter that by precisely experiences of rhythm and so on. Yeah.
Thank you.
In your work also, you show how music, whether it's Beethoven's late quartets or Mahler symphonies or even jazz that you've touched on in our conversation so far, become ways of thinking about freedom. I wonder if you could elaborate on that just a little bit further.
Sure. I mean, going back to the original story about aesthetics and modernity, at the same time as you've got Descartes' skepticism and the rise of scientific knowledge, and that strange dissonance between the two, why is it when we know more we start worrying about whether we know anything? You then get the emergence of the great Western tradition, and I'm a massive defender of it, and I feel no guilt about that, because I'm also a massive defender of jazz, etc., and other kinds of world music that I just contingently am not as much into that. And what you get with starting with sort of Monteverdi and Bach is the most astonishing, and it really is one of them, and it should be emphasized much more, I think. Astonishing rapidity of development. So you move from Bach, to atonal music in not very long, and there's a constant impetus in that tradition to push the envelope, to push the boundaries, because anything that becomes fixed can become an inhibition on your capacity to relate to the world in a more productive, more meaningful way. It's a lot more complex than that, because why is it that, and the same thing happens in even more rapidity in jazz in a way, which moves from very simple sort of up and down arpeggios to very, very complex chord substitutions, to basically using atonal things to play jazz. And why exactly that happens seems to be really crucial, because that's part of modernity. And it leads to crises. I mean, one of the things that interests me at the moment is that classical tradition, it seems to me, is in crisis, because basically the stuff one wants to hear is the tradition, i.e. back to Schoenberg sort of thing. And there were not very many pieces since then that really have had the same impact and have the same appeal to listeners. And it becomes very difficult for a composer to know what to do. I mean, the whole question about, that started in, particularly via Adorno in Darmstadt, about, music and progress becomes a real problem, because eventually you lose your audience. And either that's a sign of some major cultural problem, or it's a sign that, okay, this is a unique human event, that you had this incredibly rapid onset of modernity and the development of music. But we're not sure where we're going now. In a sense, what we now do is much more localized, that you take part of a tradition and use it. And certainly within jazz, I mean, there's so many different ways of playing you can try and adopt to and then and develop. But it won't be the kind of massive development that you had in that incredibly rapid space between Louis Armstrong starting the whole real thing of jazz, and Coltrane starting to play atonal music within how many years? I mean, it's sort of late 20s or mid 20s really, to sort of 60s, so 40 years. You get a recap of the classical tradition, and you get the same problem. I mean, so where do we go from here? And it strikes me, and it interests me that at a time when the world really is in massive crisis in every conceivable respect, that kind of reflects the disintegration of, in some ways, large parts of human culture. And how do we then oppose that? I mean, I think one way we do it is we just insist on the importance of music as being not an add-on. And look what's happened to it in schools in England. I mean, it's been decimated. And that has knock-on social effects, which are like other effects of neoliberalism. So I think we're in a really difficult situation. It really does intrigue me and worry me that I don't listen to contemporary classical music very much. Not because I find it objectionable. I can listen to God knows what, but I don't find difficult music. It doesn't do what the music I mainly listen to, i.e., the great jazz tradition, including contemporary jazz. There's plenty of great players around at the moment, but it's not culturally central in the way it was for a spell. So, that is, in a sense, it's one of the crises relate to what do we think about freedom? That at what point does freedom lead to the point where we don't know where to go? And which is actually in many ways the theme of Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus. And the answer, that was about the rise of fascism, and we're getting the rise of fascism again, everywhere virtually, in the Western world anyway.
Can I just ask, so when you decided that you would really try, and I suppose I'm wondering here about the role of canon. It's partly what we're used to hearing. What made you decide to really give Schoenberg a good go? And
reading Adorno, basically,
Okay.
because I thought I can't understand Adorno if I don't understand more of what's going on here.
So I suppose I'm partly wondering what would make you try and get into something that's more. I'm basically questioning whether you've had a good go, if you know what I mean, at really listening to some of it. It's not. It's just a provocative question, I suppose. Because we're trained to listen out for certain things, of course, and what we consider to be valuable.
I think when you get to sort of the point where I've been listening to music for God knows how long, you increasingly judge performances, for instance, by does it grab me or not, and you can't always say what it is technically about why it doesn't work, but something and. Music has to grab me, and certain parts of Schoenberg still do. I mean, but I tend to prefer the just before the atonal stuff. I mean, his D minor string quartet is fantastic, and I will sit down and try and listen to other things. Okay, it does take time, and then the simple question is that becomes an individual thing. That I'd rather spend the time listening to great performances of Bruckner because my time's running out as you get to my age. So I try and keep tabs on what's going on in classical music, but it doesn't grab me, and it doesn't grab culture in the same way. I mean, it's not central to, and that's partly the way that is down to partly the way it's been marketed and the way the market's been constituted, and down to education. And I think a surrender, of popular music has been given too much space, because it's linked. I'm not an Adornian on this at all, but its links to the market and to corporations, etc., are utterly undeniable. And okay, it's always they work out what's going to appeal, as opposed to doing what seems, what makes more musical sense, what can do something different. I mean, it's not my sort of judgment on this isn't total. It's not that it's all in a terrible mess. I think there's masses of really good music being produced in every domain. It's more about the dissemination of that music and the culture it's being disseminated into. And the culture which is, because e.g. music in schools, which is increasingly excluding people who are then bombarded by the media, especially now with the internet, etc. And capacity for discrimination is being undermined, I think, and that needs to change. And that would relate to then the need for classical music. And it's trying, but it's not very good at it, to stop being so bloody snobbish. And it's a middle class thing for middle-aged sort of people, and there needs to be a lot more done to say, look, if you get into this stuff, it's completely life-changing. There's listening to something that lasts 90 minutes as one continuous piece is something which an experience which you won't get in any other way, and people don't realise that, and they're put off classical music. It's not for me, and so on. But I don't think classical music helps itself, and I do think that there is this problem about, well, where's contemporary classical music going? It may be just diversified, and it'll always be sort of little communities doing X. And that, in some ways, is where we're going for lots of things. But one does slightly worry.
Can you tell us more about the relationship between freedom and unfreedom, and about how music then acts as a medium of freedom, which has come up a lot in our discussion already, but then as also a means of transformation, which you've touched on as well. But
Yeah, I mean, I think simply on the transformation, I mean, the transformation that someone like Beethoven does is, I mean, it even affects politics, as it were. Why would otherwise the Nazis try and appropriate it if it weren't actually politically, culturally very effective? And it's difficult then because to some degree they succeeded, but only temporarily. I think the liberation thing is that, as I said to begin with, freedom only makes sense in terms of its relation to what isn't free. And one of the things in music is that there's a hell of a lot that isn't free because rules of harmony, etc., are not it's not optional. Even if you try and disobey them all, the question is, well, does your disobeying them make any sense? And in a way, the history of jazz is the best way to illustrate that. Is the history of jazz is of the incorporation of what didn't make sense, i.e., certain notes in certain circumstances, certain kinds of rhythm, to make them make sense. So eventually, jazz improvisation. The crucial thing is that you should be using the chromatics, all notes of the chromatic scale in virtually every solo, which is unthinkable when jazz starts. But you've got to do it in a way that actually either reconstitutes the rule or follows them in some very intricate, clever way. One of the things I say in the aesthetics book is Thelonious Monk's famous line to somebody when somebody said that's not right, which, given it was Monk, you could understand why they might. And Monk famously said, "Wrong is right," and that's kind of the motto in some ways of the book, because by making notes that were wrong right, you increase the space that's available for musical articulation, and B, bring stuff into the articulation which otherwise would be ignored or repressed. You mustn't play that note. And the whole point of modern jazz is to figure out how do you play that note. I mean, when I'm improvising and I'm thinking I'm getting boring, I will deliberately play a wrong note and see what can I do to resolve it, or to, and it always works. I mean, you don't do it all the time because that would be, that makes no sense. So yeah, I think that is a kind of, it's not just a metaphor. I mean, that's an instantiation again of how you liberate material, and thereby liberate forms of expression. They give you more ways of expressing things. And that's why bebop was so important, because it was a deliberate making more complex and more difficult of music, because the music had been appropriated by commercial swing, etc. And it was black musicians who said, we want to do something different. But they did it by precisely making wrongs right, playing notes that people still find tricky sometimes, even in sort of by the time you get to Coltrane before his atonal final phase. A lot of people still find it very hard. It took me a long time to get Coltrane, for instance, until I was 40. I just didn't understand what he was doing. It felt kind of random, and why is he playing that note, sort of thing. And that seems to me, that's the perfect example of the sort of thing I mean, is that you take something which is used to be wrong and make it right. And the history of music is perfect for illustrating that. All the things that certain kinds of harmony and counterpoint wouldn't allow you to do, people find ways of doing it, and thereby create more space. And that is a useful metaphor for saying, if there's something that's neglected or you're not supposed to do, how could we do it without simply following the reasons why you're not supposed to do it? Doing something that makes no sense, and that seems to me absolutely crucial. And that can happen at an individual level as well. That you slowly realise, you can do this. And that's almost the best way of putting it. If you by pushing the envelope, you realise you can do this, even though it's supposed to be wrong, and then wrong becomes right. And that was basically the metaphor of the whole book, the aesthetics book. Is that that's how modern art works. It incorporates more and more things that were previously excluded, and that's a useful thing in terms of cultural issues and social issues as well, and racial issues for that matter.
And that really, there are two, in terms of your thinking around freedom, and I won't call it a definition because, as you said, there's no definition.
Because you get stamped on.
Yeah. But freedom as the need to transcend a ground, as in constraints of whatever kind. But not only that, but so you say very beautifully, it's not some kind of capacity for absolute beginnings, but rather a self-critical awareness of the possibility of interrogating the grounds of what we do. So that's, I suppose, because it can be quite simplistic to think, well, yes, music allows us to go beyond in different ways, but it's not just about that. It's about actually being critically aware of what is inhibiting, how it's inhibiting, as you've just been demonstrating, and moving beyond that somehow.
Yeah. I mean, even the fact of doing music rather than something else, which certainly for me, turns into the most meaningful thing I do, apart from bringing up children, sort of thing, or being an educator. The very fact that there is this cultural resource that is inexhaustible. And which relies on precisely, as you say, a self-critical sense of, well, am I doing this well enough? And then you get this the romantic German romantic idea, which I don't think is not airy-fairy. Novalis says this about the absolute, whatever that is, answer we don't know. That we become aware of it through our failure to actually achieve it. And that seems to me what's going on in so much artistic production is you're never going to finally get it right. But it doesn't mean you can't keep doing it better. And so you're pursuing this thing, which would be, you'd play the perfect solo or you'd write the perfect movement or whatever. And as soon as you reflect on it, you think, well, you can't do that. But why is it that the impetus to get it as right as you can is so strong? And again, it's not about knowledge; it's about what you can do, and that's why I'm a big fan of the Romantics. They quite often stress this. It's more about Dewey's the same. So what do we do that's informed by these sorts of ideas? And doing music and doing it properly is precisely a way of, involves a certain sort of transcendence, etc.
And this movement between freedom and unfreedom is not a simple, it's not a binary. As in,
No,
one can move into, one can become more unfree.
Well, yeah, I mean, in music, the conventions of a certain style can become unfree. That's which is why people move on beyond it. Otherwise, if you were to follow the rules of harmony at a certain period, look at the classical tradition again, you wouldn't get what we then get. The music that challenges all that, through to Wagner, etc. And the same thing in jazz. I mean, the conventions are we need conventions, hence the thing it's not a binary. Without them, you can't. You've got nothing to oppose, and so the two are inextricably bound up. That's why I regularly cite lots of Schelling on this. Schelling's essay on freedom is brilliant and all that. He doesn't talk about music, but it applies very easily to what goes on in music.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So then, in a sense, can we say that freedom is a lived practice, a kind of everyday lived practice, where, maybe not a practice of survival, but a practice of being otherwise that looks towards a kind of futurity within the face of an unending freedom?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware it's getting suspiciously close to a definition, but yeah, I would go along with that. I mean, that's why I've recently become very enamored of Dewey, because that's the way he talks about it. Because nothing would make any sense if there's nothing to overcome, and we overcome through practices, not just through knowing things. So I mean, the meaningfulness of playing for me is, which I don't need to question in a way. It's something that if I can't do it, then something's completely wrong with my life, as it were. If I can't listen and so on. So it is a lived practice in that way, because it's something that keeps opening space. I mean, links to then, questions about how we construe meaning. Because the analytical tradition construes meaning in semantic terms, in terms of how we define meaning as words, or if not define, characterize meaning as words. But it doesn't say very much about meaning in the sense of meaning being about why things matter. And too much of human existence is doesn't reflect on that. Why does it matter that we do X? This should be the first philosophical question. Why is X an issue in the first place? And that's a question of meaningfulness rather than meaning in the sense of what do words mean, etc., which is a kind of subsidiary. And of course, words don't have meanings in that sense. I'm a Wittgensteinian on that. They gain their meanings through their use, and that you can change how you use the words. And we don't, culture is healthy when it's doing that a lot, and we don't do enough of that. To find new ways of articulating what's wrong, what disturbs us, what matters, and so on. Is this a pregnant pause? Or is it nobody knows who's supposed to be speaking?
Well, Sharissa's got a great question that I know you will love.
Okay. I mean, I think I can connect it to that. So suggesting that music enacts freedom by holding together contradiction, perhaps in ways that philosophy cannot. So if art discloses truths about freedom that concepts can't capture, should philosophy itself change in the light of this?
Yeah, I do like that question.
I
To
knew
which
it.
my answer is yes. I mean, A, I'm retired, so I have nothing to lose, as it were. B, I've always been deeply suspicious of philosophy. I mean, I studied modern languages. I have no qualifications in philosophy apart from a large number of books. And I've always found mainly the analytical tradition, but there's plenty of stuff in the European tradition that's equally irritating. That asking questions that don't matter. So the first question should be, why does this matter? Not is it true, or what is X, or how do we, And so looking at the ways in which things matter, because clearly, argument and so on in philosophy matters, but it doesn't do what's on the. It's not that you then arrive at something which is satisfactory, and that seems to be the crucial thing that escapes. Why isn't this the central topic of analytical philosophers? Why don't we get theories that are like theories in the sciences, which actually enable us to do things and can change the world? Whereas theories in the philosophy change philosophy a bit. The return to metaphysics and people like Timothy Williamson, everyone then obsesses about that for 20 years or something. And I just can't see the point. I quote this endlessly, but what kind of things there really are is what metaphysics is about. No, it's not. That's what science tells us. If you want to know, break down the universe into its component parts, and it's brilliant at doing it. And we may end up at the point where there's not a lot more to know in that respect. But that does doesn't explain, and this is why I like A.W. Moore's book on modern metaphysics. Metaphysics should be about how to make sense of things, and philosophy is too little about how to make sense of things. And the great philosophers I've spent my time with fundamentally are concerned with that. They're not obsessed by epistemology. They see it, as I do, as a symptom of something in the modern world that doesn't make sense. I.e., the fact that we know more and more, and yet the world doesn't get better. And as we know at the moment, it's actually getting worse to the point where, it really is grim at the moment. People just don't understand that climate change is not just about getting flooded out. It means war and mass immigration. And the short-sightedness of people's view of the world at the moment is incredible. And that's, in some ways, this is a fault of bad philosophy never taking on the big issues in a way, because we need to deal with the nuts and bolts of communications. No, we don't. We need to deal with the world and how it makes sense, and it doesn't make sense as it is at the moment. Which is why cultural things like music, which engage people, which give you a purpose, which can't be exhausted, are so important. I mean, philosophy can be like that, and in some way, my point of the aesthetics book is that philosophy can be a kind of art, and art can be a kind of philosophy. At its best, in best of Wittgenstein and the best of Heidegger and so on, it is a kind of art. I mean, it reveals things. It's not that it wins any arguments, which is what the cognitivist view of philosophy would assume it has to do, because you don't win philosophical argument. You do temporarily, but you might feel good about it. Now, things I'm saying are all stated as propositional claims. So, are they true? Can they be defended? Well, but no, because what I'm doing is saying we should be attending more to the things we do that do make sense in ways which are not problematic in the ways that a lot of what goes on in the world are. And that's why music seems to be very important.
Is it that transformation of practice and ways of making sense of things that you see as the common denominator, bringing together philosophy and music? Is that ideally what should be happening?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and that's very much what Dewey says. I mean, I should have discovered Dewey early. I mean, I had read some, but because he's so he's clear. He was kind of shoot off the stage by American analytical philosophy. But he's coming back now with quite a vengeance, I think. And as the United States disintegrates, and the number of philosophers in the States that have defended Trump, you wouldn't believe. As a Nazi, for God's sake, where are we? If that's where it leads. So So yeah, Dewey seems to me is the man of the moment in a lot of ways, because he's concerned with our practices and not getting bogged down in theoretical things. It's about, well, how does this change what we do?
I wondered, previously you said, music is not an add-on, and art is not supplemental, um, to anything else. How do we elude falling in that trap of it actually being an add-on? Because I'm seeing that a lot, especially coming from music studies or cultural studies where, it's kind of tacked on, but it's not really worked with or interrogated, as an avenue of understanding, of making sense, of questioning.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there needs to be a rethink of education. I mean, there's plenty of people in education who are aware of this. I mean, the disaster in England of Tory reform to education, which ended up basically with more rote learning and so on, of stuff that people forget as soon as they're not. One should be looking at things that can inform people's lives for the rest of their lives, and underrating music as being something which everyone has some kind of stance on. The more people are engaged in it, the better it will get. As when we did have very good music tuition and all sorts of systems for getting people involved in music, and these need to be restored. I mean, it's not. It's a sort of spending that government. It costs money. Things like that don't cost money because they actually end up saving money. And the more culture you have, the arts in England, in Britain rather, make more money or used to make more money than the car industry, and they certainly probably do now. So it's about people's perception about what matters, and the whole focus on endless technological improvements to things that are good enough already, as opposed to how do we get people more involved in things that they are actively able to do stuff with. And that's why people rightly are worried about AI. That sure, if I'm sure it could do it now if you fed a certain AI with most of the Mozart symphonies and say produce something the same, it will probably do it, and it will probably sound quite good. But that's telling you something about why people moved on from Mozart. If you're just reproducing what's there. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I mean, the jazz I play is basically 60s style jazz, but it doesn't feel like that because you're constantly. Point about 60s jazz was it was always pushing the envelope anyway, so you're moving on to the next stage of it, and things like that that give you a constant challenge to do something different and to see things differently must play a bigger role in education than they do at the moment. I mean, the same would apply, to literature and to art as well. I mean, the way they challenge the way we perceive things and so on.
Yeah, thank you.
So to finish, really, I wonder whether, I mean, I think we know the answer to this already, but I wonder if to kind of bring the thing together, I wonder what you think music contributes then to conceptions of freedom and liberation and how we speak about it.
I think I would start with the fact that when it comes to, if we try and explain why music is powerful, what it's doing, what it means, we know we can't do it, and yet we still want to do it. That's actually the basic structure of what I want. That informs what I'm trying to say, is that something which is cannot be cashed out into something else, which is a practice which you have to be involved in, is exemplary for how we culture can function successfully. And philosophy attends to that far too little. I mean, philosophy of music, my least favourite subject, is desperately trying to tell us is music expressive? Yes. do we, by clarifying conceptually, what it means, get to the bottom of it? And the answer is clearly no, because that way you'd obviate it. So if you clarify conceptually what we learned from Beethoven's Ninth or Coltrane's Love Supreme, you wouldn't need to listen to it anymore, which is clearly patent nonsense. It doesn't mean then that those things wouldn't actually improve the way you hear things. Good music criticism or analysis or good philosophy of music will make you hear music differently. But the bottom line, though, is this sense of it resists. It's a sort of a ground that resists full articulation, and that's why it has to keep moving, because there's no answer in that way. But in a post-theological world, that's what we're supposed to be living with. I think I'll stop with that. That deep remark.
It just remains to say thank you, Andrew, for joining us, for helping us think about, I don't know, this idea of freedom and ground, reflective self-awareness of that, and music as not only a metaphor, but as this kind of practice that can help to transform. It will really resonate, I think, with other conversations. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks for coming all the way from Trinidad. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.